Welcome back. Here we are in, well, probably it's part 3, isn't it? But I didn't do part 2, unless I've done a part 2. And here we're on to part 3. But this is part 3 because someone else came in on Sunday morning and did the part 2. So I hope you're following that. It doesn't really matter. But anyway, we're looking at 2 Corinthians and loving it. So I'm going to read it. It's quite a long chunk to read this bit, but I'm a big fan of reading the scriptures properly rather than just taking a verse and then hitting people over the head and using it to kind of promote your own prejudices. I think you should read the whole thing as much of it as you can. Look at the context, get a feel of the flow. The Bible wasn't written as sound bites. It's a story. It's a story of God's presence with us, and you cannot tell a story with a sound bite. Unless it's one of those weird tell a story in 12 sentences, but even then, there's a lot of backstory they miss out. I don't know why I'm talking about this. Should we just crack on with it? In 2 Corinthians chapter 4, reading from verse 16, it says this. I'll tell you what it says when I'm on the right page. It says this. Good job I'm editing all this out, innit? For this reason we never become discouraged, even though our physical being is gradually decaying, yet our spiritual being is renewed day after day. And this small and temporary trouble that we suffer will bring us tremendous and eternal glory, much greater than the trouble. For we fix our attention not on things that are seen, but on things that are unseen. What can be seen lasts only a while, but what cannot be seen lasts forever. For we know that when this tent we live in, our body here on earth, is torn down, God will have a house in heaven for us to live in, a home he himself has made, which will last forever. And now we sigh, so great is our desire that our home which comes from heaven should be put on over us. By being clothed with it, we shall not be without a body. While we live in this earthly tent, we groan with the feeling of oppression. It's not that we want to be rid of our earthly body, but that we want to have our heavenly one put on over us, so that what is mortal will be transformed by life. God is the one who's prepared us for this change, and he gave us his Spirit as the guarantee of all that he has in store for us. So we're always full of courage. We know that as long as we're at home in the body, we are away from the Lord's home. For our life is a matter of faith, not of sight. We're full of courage and would much prefer to leave our home in the body and be at home with the Lord. More than anything else, however, we want to please him, whether in our home, here or there. For all of us must appear before Christ to be judged by him. We will each receive what we deserve according to everything we've done, good or bad, in our bodily life. We know what it means to fear the Lord, and so we try to persuade others. God knows us completely, and I hope that in your hearts you know me as well. We're not trying again to recommend ourselves to you. Rather, we're trying to give you a good reason to be proud of us, so that you'll be able to answer those who boast about people's appearance and not about their character. This is where he's talking about the uber apostles. Remember in the first section we talked a bit about that. Are we really insane? It's for God's sake. Or are we sane? Well, then it's for your sake. We're ruled by the love of Christ, now that we recognise that one man died for everyone, which means that all share in his death. He died for all, so that those who live should no longer live for themselves, but only for him who died and was raised to life for their sake. No longer then do we judge anyone by human standards. Even if one time we judged Christ according to human standards, we no longer do so. Anyone who's joined to Christ is a new being. The old is gone and the new has come. And all this is done by God, who through Christ changed us from his enemies into his friends and gave us the task of making others his friends as well. Our message is that God was making the whole human race his friends through Christ. God didn't keep account of their wrongs, and he's given us the message which tells how he makes them his friends. So here we are then, speaking for Christ as though God himself will make his appeal through us. We plead on Christ's behalf. Let God change you from his enemies into his friends. Christ was without sin, but for our sake God made him share our sin, in order that in union with him we might share the righteousness of God. In our work together with God then, we beg you who have received God's grace not to let it be wasted. Now I know there's a lot there. You might want to pause this and have a cup of tea, I don't know. And there's repetition, which Paul does quite a lot. And don't be afraid to say there's repetition, because he's making the point. And when he was doing this was probably by dictation. So he would have been talking and someone would have been writing it down. And you know, when you speak, you say things one way and then you say them another way. Because that's when you speak. That's what you do, isn't it? You repeat yourself. Anyway, now when I first read this, I was surprisingly moved. I was actually on my way to the hospital for an appointment, for an eye check. Now, as many of you know, some of you, well, whoever's been listening lately, well, we all know this bit actually. Your body reaches a point in aging, doesn't it? When it stops doing what it used to do as well as it used to do it. Bits start falling off, don't they, or breaking up. Anyway, one of my terrors, and this is a genuine terror, is going blind. And it's one of the things when I wake up in the middle of the night, my brain thinks, why don't you worry about this? You know how your brain finds things for you to worry about. That's one of mine. And Paul here is talking about this, not about my blindness. He's talking about us preparing for the moment when our physicalness, our physicality fails us, to work on our spiritual as well as our physical lives. And here he tries to put things into perspective. He calls it this small and temporary trouble. Well, I mean, I would say it doesn't always feel small or temporary, these troubles that we face. And those people that say pain is all in the mind, well, they've clearly never actually felt real pain. And while in a sense they are right, because it is in your mind, that's where you acknowledge it, it's where you notice it, isn't it? So the pain is in the mind in that sense. It doesn't mean it's not real. Now we have to resist the trap, I think, in the church, and it's a tempting trap to fall into, and it's all over society generally, this sort of idea that the physical and the spiritual are two very different things. And the temptation the church has had right from the very start, partly what John's Gospel is talking about, is this idea that the spiritual is better somehow than the physical. The physical isn't important. The physical is just a burden that we have to bear. But the physical is good, and the physical is godly. God didn't make the physical world by accident or as a training ground for the next bit. It's important and it's of value right now and in its own right. And that's why what we do now is important. How we help, how we love, how we build the kingdom. It matters. It matters how we treat people, our friends and our colleagues and our family and refugees, people that are different to us, our enemies. It matters. It matters how we treat creation, the environment and animals, the food chain, our rivers. Even though it will only last a time, it matters. But to put some perspective on it, it is not all that there is. It is not all that there will be. So we can lift our eyes and we can see more. And know that when this tent is gone, this clay pot that is our temporary current existence is gone, that God will have prepared a place for us. We're not just going to be spirits drifting about in space. Paul describes a corporeal existence, doesn't he? A physical existence, but one that we can't comprehend at this point. We can grasp, I guess, the idea of there being more because we all know what it means to have physical restrictions, don't we? Different levels or types of ability, illness, restrictions that we have with our minds. All of these are normal. None of us can do everything. And all of us, and all these things, are part of what all of us know it means to be human. We know that there are restrictions. We are contained and restrained. But the next stage of existence, well, that's going to be different. We will be transformed. We will be free. And our experience of faith, of the Holy Spirit now, gives us a foretaste of what that's going to be. It's a bit like when you know those times when you do feel liberated or joyful or pain-free. They're a foretaste of what is to come. And so we long, we wait for the day. And this is where it gets tricky, particularly for those of us who tend to be more rational than emotional, those of us that run on rational thinking rather than our hearts. And do not misunderstand me there, because neither one is better than the other. Now, societies, depending which society you're in, will value one over the other very often, but they are both important. You need both. You need sunshine and rain, don't you? You need your head and your heart. But this is where those of us who are more head may struggle. Because it's about faith. And faith is an act of will, partly an act of love. Faith is an act of will, yes, just as love is an act of will. But it is also an action of the heart. And life, says Paul, is a matter of faith, not of sight. It's a different way of seeing things, a different way of measuring truth, a different way of understanding. It's trusting, it's believing without seeing. Now, we've narrowed that down a lot in our society, and we've said, well, if you can't measure it, it's not true, which we know is nonsense. It's nonsense. Just because you can't understand something in a certain way doesn't mean it's not true. You could say music doesn't exist. You can't see it, or you can hear it, so you experience it in a different way. And spirituality is the same. So for all that, I won't believe it till I see it kind of attitude that many of us have, we kind of do believe many things that we don't see. We believe what's at the centre of the earth. We believe reports on the news. We believe some of the stuff we see on the internet. We believe the science of molecules. We take a lot on trust in the physical realm, but we tend to step back or look at it sideways when it comes to the spiritual realm. I don't know why that is. It's a cultural thing, I think. Post-enlightenment, postmodernism, I don't know, postal service, I don't know, you know. But I think certainly in our culture and our society, we find it much harder to accept the spiritual truths. So the life of faith is harder because it involves trust. And that is risky because we could be wrong. We could look stupid. We could be let down. We find it hard to prove it to someone else, don't we? To explain to someone else. Well, I just know. It's just kind of... But that's what faith is. But faith gives us hope. It gives us courage to step out and to trust that God won't let us down. He won't let us fall. And when we or our loved ones particularly, when we're faced with death, we trust that we will go home to be with God. There's people in this church who have that longing to go, older people. And I kind of envy that because I don't feel it myself. It's not that they want to die. It's just they're like, okay, I'm ready to meet God now. Yeah, it's been good. It's been a blast. And now it's time. And I'm quite content. I won't name them, but there's one or two people in the church who aren't well. And they're like, this is that, and they're quite content waiting for this tent to go, this earthly tent, and God to put a new home over them. We have hope. I have hope. The promise of God that this trouble that we face is temporary, that the pain will not last. And I think that's a goal, isn't it? That's a life goal for faith. To be in a position where we love and appreciate life, but we also long to be with God and look forward to being with Him. This is great, yeah, but it will be greater. And here at the end of this first section is why the now is important, why the physical is important. Because Paul says, all must appear before Christ to be judged by Him, Each one will receive what they deserve according to everything they've done, good or bad, in their bodily life. So there you go. Just ponder that for a moment. What's he just said? Because here we have another one in the eye. For those who say salvation is about praying the prayer or about a private spirituality where we pray and avoid everything else. We are judged not by what we think, not what we sign up to. We're not even judged by what we believe. Paul says quite plainly here, as Jesus does in one of his stories, Paul says quite plainly, we are judged by what we do. We're judged by Jesus. So it's fairly easy from that to work out what are we meant to be doing, because he actually told us. Jesus had said, well, these are the things you've got to do. Now read one of the Gospels. If you're confused over what Jesus' followers are meant to be like, read the Gospel, anyone, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John even, and you'll see quite plainly and quite clearly what you're meant to do. Go and do that. And then the second half of the chapter brings us to one of the themes that runs, interestingly, through John's Gospel. We are transformed into, and here it is, we are transformed into God's friends. Paul, for all of his bossing around and telling people off that he has a reputation for, he understands the relationship. He understands what faith is. And perhaps one of the unique things about being a disciple of Jesus, being a Christian, is that we are God's friends. We're more than servants or slaves. And that imagery, yes, it is used elsewhere to make other points, but at the heart of it, we're friends. This is a different type of religion we're in here, and we should work on that between us in a church and between the churches. And then Paul does get into his salvation theology, and like the friendship, like the being judged by what we do, this is another aspect of salvation that the church has ignored because it hasn't really been in fashion. The fashionable concept of salvation is that Jesus died on the cross to avenge or to calm a vengeful and angry God. And that imagery is there. But the church has talked about that like that is the only way we can understand the cross. But it's not. Because and while on the rider to that, people have also preached that the only way then that you have to do is you have to give your life to the Lord Jesus Christ. You need to pray that prayer, and then you are saved through the blood of the Lamb. Now, taken as in isolation, none of those sentences are inaccurate. But if you take them as that's all of the whole truth, well, then you're missing out, and you start not telling the whole truth, just a part of it. Because here's the kicker. Because Paul says all of the human race has become God's friends through what Christ did. Not just the keen Christians, not just the Christians who agree with me, all people. It says it right here. All of them. That's it. It's in the gospel. It's in the Bible, sorry. In black and white. There it is. That's what it says. And he calls the church to tell everyone this good news. You see, we don't have to save or convert anyone. They already are. Through the actions of Christ. Christ has already redeemed everyone through his death on the cross. And also through his life and ministry before that. And his resurrection after that. Our job is to let people know. To tell them, you're now God's friends. It's okay. It's going to be all right. That's our job. And that puts a whole new perspective on things. Because the mainstream church statements about salvation for a long time have been just about Jesus' death on the cross. His blood paid the price. He died in our place. And there's truth there. There's power in that. But the events of the cross and the life and resurrection of Jesus are too much to be contained in this single model, this single understanding. That angle of the cross is helpful. Yeah, but there is more. There's a depth and a richness to what salvation is and how it works. And how can our human minds really grasp how God makes it work? God's ideas around forgiveness and grace. We have a go, don't we? But we mess it up so often. So Paul uses a different angle to say that Jesus took it on. He took the wrong onto himself, the evil in the world onto himself. He became us so that we could become him. So in identifying with the human race in such an intimate, powerful way, and this is why the whole of the story of Jesus is important, the incarnation, from the birth to the resurrection, all of that is important. It's not just the cross. The cross is important, but so is everything else. In identifying with the human race in such an intimate and powerful way, because God entered that experience, we are able to enter into God. If you've ever been with someone who's going through difficulty or severe illness or a danger, you'll know that by opening yourselves in that way to each other, there's a bond created. Something happens, and it's something mystical that you can't quite explain. When you go through the fire with someone, there's something happens to both of you, both the person who's the sufferer and the person who is walking with them. And it is the same thing with Jesus and the incarnation and his life, death and resurrection. God walked with us. He knows. And we walk with him. We become friends on a level that's not possible at a distance. We join in union with him and share his righteousness. And when we talk about the gates of heaven being opened up, this is what it means. Jesus, the incarnated God, opened up a two-way street to heaven. So that's a bit of a journey, that chapter. It's quite chunky, isn't it? From physical vulnerability, it journeys all the way through to this idea of union with God. But that's what happens in that chapter. It flows wonderfully, I think, from the human physical limitations, that we will be clothed in new bodies, which we don't understand at this point. But from that, we are given an eternal hope, which brings us out of a self-obsessed life into a life that's lived for others. Oh, yeah. And this changes us, and this puts us right through our union with Jesus, which he achieved through his life and his death and his resurrection. Tell you what, that's a lot of theology packed in there. So what I suggest you do now is make yourself a cup of tea, go and have a long lie down, and thank God that even if we don't understand the mechanics of it, we can understand the result. And the result is we are friends of God. We are loved, accepted, and saved. Read it again, 2 Corinthians chapter 5. It's good stuff. God bless. See you next time. Bye-bye.